So, today we're diving into a pretty fascinating psychological mystery. Have you ever wondered why we can feel intensely, and I mean painfully lonely, even when we're literally surrounded by people? Well, we're going to break down the complex neuroscience of social exhaustion to figure that out. And to do it, we're going to dissect a very specific, deeply terrifying dream.
Seriously, think about this for a second. You're at a party, maybe a networking event, or just hanging out with a massive group of friends. Everyone's laughing, the energy is super high, but your mind just kind of checks out, right? You get this bizarre, creeping sense of isolation. It's almost like you're watching the whole scene unfold from behind a thick sheet of glass. It's this highly relatable feeling of subjective loneliness. And as we're going to see, your brain has a very dramatic way of processing that feeling when you finally go to sleep.
To wrap our heads around this, let's look at the central framing device for our explainer today. We're analyzing a clinical case study of a really bizarre dream. And the thing is, it actually starts off amazingly well. The dreamer is just hanging out, playing games with friends, and then it seamlessly transitions into them being on this massive, ultra-luxurious global cruise ship. I'm talking cheers, splashing water, brilliant sunshine, the whole 9 yards. But then, the dream rapidly devolves from this joyful social gathering into a dark, genuinely terrifying pursuit. It is a total emotional crash. So the big question is, why on earth does the sleeping brain do this to us? Well, to understand the why, we really have to look at the clinical science of why we dream in the very first place. First up, we've got the activation synthesis hypothesis. This basically suggests that dreams are just the brain making up stories from totally random neural signals. But honestly, that doesn't really explain the highly structured terror of our cruise ship dream. Then there's the threat simulation theory. This one argues that our brains are actually evolutionarily hardwired to rehearse surviving deadly threats while we sleep. But wait, initially the dreamer was having a blast. And that brings us to the social simulation theory, which is the brain actively rehearsing social bonding and group cooperation. So the absolute crucial point here is this. What exactly caused the brain to violently snap from simulating happy social bonds to rehearsing for a deadly, terrifying threat? Believe it or not, the turning point in the dream was surprisingly mundane. It was a classic micro-rejection. Here's what happens. The protagonist visits a friend's cabin and simply asks to grab a cigarette from a pack scattered on the table, and the friend just casually says no. That's it. Everyone else in the room is smoking, but the dreamer is denied. This tiny, seemingly insignificant moment of being treated just a little differently, it triggers a massive, catastrophic shift in the brain's internal simulation. It is literally a perfect mirror of real life. You know those tiny moments where you're left on red or politely excluded from an inside joke? You might laugh it off in the moment, but trust me, your subconscious registers it as a massive alarm. And here is exactly why that internal alarm goes off. When it comes to your brain's actual circuitry, there is literally zero difference between physical trauma and social alienation. I mean it. The scientific reality is that our nervous system processes the pain of being socially excluded exactly like a literal bleeding physical injury. Just empathize with that for a second. That creeping feeling of isolation you get at the party, your brain is quite literally screaming that you are physically wounded. Okay, let's look at how this actually builds up in your nervous system. When you face social exclusion, this little alarm bell in your brain called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DACC, starts firing off like crazy. It detects that exclusion as a literal survival threat. Then the anterior insula steps in. It translates that alarm into the highly subjective feeling of a breathless, aching pain right in your chest. And get this, if you happen to have a specific mutation in the OPRM1 gene, which manages your opioid receptors, your system is genetically hypersensitive to this pain. Your brain literally believes that being pushed out of the tribe means you are going to die. No joke. So let's jump back into our dream. The brain's alarm bells are now absolutely ringing, and the dream environment instantly changes to match that panic. The bright, cheerful cruise ship pool area, it vanishes completely. Suddenly, the protagonist finds themselves walking down this dark, sticky, and dead silent hallway. All the lighting is just gone. This dark descent perfectly mirrors the sudden crash we feel in real life, right after we exhaust all our energy on social masking. You know the drill. You spend all day smiling, pretending you aren't hurt by those little micro-rejections, and when you finally get home and shut the door, everything just goes dark and incredibly heavy.
We actually have a clinical term for this awful feeling. It's called the introvert hangover, and it represents severe social burnout. If you're naturally introverted or if you're a highly sensitive person, socializing requires massive cognitive processing. You're constantly simulating whether you're saying the right thing just to avoid rejection. And this floods your system with way more dopamine than it can handle, which completely drains your energy. If you don't get a chance for your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest mode, to fully reset, you hit an absolute brick wall. Your internal battery doesn't just dip a little bit, it completely and totally crashes.
Now, what happens when you crash, but society is still demanding that you keep going? Well, the dream turns into a full-blown nightmare pursuit. The dreamer is running down this massive water slide, frantically trying to escape. But they are being relentlessly chased by two incredibly bizarre figures: a man in a sharp suit aggressively trying to sell them pills, and a doctor holding this menacing yellow syringe. These aren't just random movie monsters, by the way. They are very real clinical symptoms of waking life, manifesting right there in the dream. To decode the absolute terror of being hunted like this, we've got to talk about rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD. Basically, this is an extreme emotional sensitivity to even the perception of rejection. It is incredibly common in neurodivergent nervous systems, like in folks with ADHD or autism, and in highly sensitive persons. For someone dealing with RSD, a micro-rejection isn't just a bummer of a moment. It feels like an immediate fatal threat. That relentless pursuit down the water slide in the dream, that is the visceral physical feeling of a nervous system that is trapped in a hyper-vigilant state, constantly anticipating the next crushing social blow.
Let's map out these visual metaphors a bit more. The man in the suit and the doctor, they aren't random at all. They're literal embodiments of societal demands. They are authoritative figures trying to force something totally foreign onto the dreamer. They represent that heavy pressure to conform, to just take your medicine, and to just be quote-unquote normal. And that relentless pursuit, that represents a psychological concept known as pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. It's this extreme anxiety response where the brain views any external demand or expectation as a massive, overwhelming threat to its autonomy. The dreamer is literally running from the agonizing pressure to fit in.
The chase finally leads to a hiding spot, but man, it is chilling. The dreamer manages to evade these chasers by climbing into this cold metal drawer. But as they look around, they have a horrifying realization. They're in a morgue. And lying in the drawers all around them are the lifeless bodies of their friends from the cruise ship. The international team, the local buddies, all of them, dead. That bright, beautiful social gathering has entirely collapsed into a silent, freezing room of corpses. And then comes the absolute climax of the nightmare. The dead suddenly animate. But, twist, they don't attack to kill. Instead, they grab the dreamer and violently tear their hands off right from the wrists. But here is the most crucial detail. There is absolutely no physical pain. None. The dreamer just watches their own hands get amputated, feeling zero physical pain, but experiencing this overwhelming, paralyzing wave of pure, unfiltered terror. Okay, let's decode this really grim symbolism. The morgue and those dead friends, they represent a profound existential dread, the total collapse of our attachment systems. It's this incredibly deep subconscious fear that no matter how good a social event feels in the moment, those bonds are fragile and they will inevitably die. And that painless amputation, well, our hands are how we interact with the world, right? It's how we hold on to things. Having them violently torn off signifies a total, devastating loss of personal agency and power. You are rendered entirely helpless. But wait, why was there absolutely no pain? That specific detail points to an incredible built-in survival mechanism: dissociation. When stress or trauma hits a level that the brain simply cannot process, it essentially pulls the emergency brake. Clinically, this is known as a dorsal vagal shutdown. The nervous system completely numbs the body, shutting off physical pain to protect you. But here's the kicker. The amygdala keeps right on recording the pure emotional terror. That painless amputation in the dream? It's a massive, flashing red warning light from the subconscious, screaming that the dreamer's waking life is pushing them toward total emotional collapse and systemic burnout. But you know what? Here is where we actually find some hope in this clinical analysis. Think back to a moment before the nightmare spiraled completely out of control. The dreamer actually stood up and announced to the group, "I'm going home." Now, society often frames leaving a party early as a weakness or like you're being a buzzkill. But neurologically speaking, this was a profound sign of strength. The dreamer's subconscious was actively trying to assert a boundary, trying its hardest to remove the nervous system from a severely depleting situation before the crash happened. And honestly, that empowers us with some highly actionable self-care strategies for our waking lives. First, you've got to start noticing those tiny discomforts. Don't just ignore that micro-rejection or that sudden weird drop in your social battery. Second, validate your feelings without the guilt. Your brain is generating very real pain signals to protect you. It is absolutely not you just being overly sensitive. And finally, actively step away to protect your energy. Building assertive boundaries isn't selfish in the slightest. It's practically an ethical requirement for maintaining your mental health and preventing that agonizing introvert hangover.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. These vivid, incredibly stressful dreams aren't just random static in your brain. They are deeply intelligent, crucial signals from a nervous system that is fighting tooth and nail to keep you safe in a world that constantly demands your energy. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, I really want you to ask yourself, what is your dream trying to warn you about? Pay attention to those subtle discomforts in your waking life so you don't have to be chased in the dark when you close your eyes. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.